And as Gary suggested, we can analyze phenotypic data in that way and get a hierarchy by a method that has no evolutionary implications at all. There is a history in it, but the history is ontogenetic. The history is what gives you the direction in von Bayer's law. We don't have to infer anything more about the geological history, for example. So what about this molecular level, the level of protein and DNA sequences? How do we recognize the hierarchy there? First of all, the concept of homology is much vaguer at those levels, and we don't have ontogeny and von Bayer's law to guide us. Now, I suggested in commenting on the DNA data that the hierarchy is recognized by massaging the data with evolutionary theory. Put it through a program that's based on evolutionary theory, and naturally you get a hierarchy out. I wonder if the data is hierarchical without massage of that sort. I don't know, but at the protein sequence level, where I haven't played about a lot, my impression is that it's very strongly hierarchical when you have a few sequences, or when you select a few so that you're just doing 5 or 6 taxon problems. But when you take a big set of data, like all the myoglobins that are now available, my experience is that the hierarchy simply melts away, unless you force it by massaging it with evolutionary theory. And as for the DNA level, of course nobody knows. All we have at the moment is these 5 short sequences. They are hierarchical to this extent. But because of this problem of getting 25% matches purely by chance, I predict that that hierarchy will melt away very rapidly as DNA sequences start to come in. But if that's so, what is it that puts the hierarchy into the phenotype data if the hierarchy isn't there at the protein or the DNA level? Well, obviously, it's ontogeny. And the hierarchy of ontogeny. And it can be investigated without any preconceptions about evolution. And why is evolutionary theory necessary in systematics? I seem to end up with this odd conclusion. It's necessary to impose hierarchical order on recalcitrant data. Evolutionary theory in systematics is a massage machine to impose hierarchy when none may exist. If that's so, don't you think systematics would be better off without the theory? I think I'll stop. I was going to end with some quotes. I think, if I may, I'll just give you the last one. No, I won't. I'll give you the third. From Darwin in The Origin. When the views entertained in this volume are generally omitted, systematists will be able to pursue their labours as at present, and by at present, Darwin means as in pre-Darwinian times, as in pre-evolutionary biology. He's saying, don't let the theory get in the way of systematics. People seem not to have listened to him. The last quote is from Gillespie again, and it concerns J.D. Hooker, the botanist. If you think about it, Hooker was the only professional systematist amongst the Darwin coterie. He was also Darwin's oldest confidant. He'd been reading all of Darwin's manuscripts and talking to him solidly since 1840. And yet, he remained unconverted to evolution until 1859. And here is Gillespie on the reason why Hooker was not converted. Hooker adopted the view that species were immutable and each descended from a single pair. This was not necessarily his belief, but a methodological postulate to make classification possible. And then Gillespie makes the point again later on in the book like this. Hooker believed that the taxonomist, who was an evolutionist, must ignore his theory and proceed as if species were immutable. In other words, evolution may very well be true, but basing one's systematics on that belief will give bad systematics. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry to have gone so long.
Are you serious? I've got quite a lot of things to say. I've been taking notes on my official Willie Hennig tablet. No, I'm going to give it all in one burst. Well, Colin, you suggested, I think in some, that it's hard to distinguish evolutionism from creationism. That's a quote. I bothered to copy it down. And you gave a lot of examples. It seems to me you skipped over a point, and And I'm going to say what that point is, and then I'm going to describe exactly how it bears on your examples in kind of an obverse way. There's a point that you skipped over, and namely that, well, let's see, Meyer was your favorite example. You said that Meyer keeps appealing to the unknown. When the genome was unknown, Meyer appealed to that, and then when the genome became known, Meyer appealed to something else. And yes, this is a true statement of Meyer. I've often noticed it myself. I may even have noticed it before you did, despite the fact that you're much more experienced than I am. But the difference between that Meyer, the one who appeals to the unknown, and the creationist that wants to explain everything by appealing to something which is unknown except as something that is, everybody would agree, a matter of faith, is that people that are forced to give an honest answer to the question will admit that when Meyer does that, he's being a bad scientist, whereas nobody imagines that appealing to the unknown is being a bad creationist. In other words, scientists are supposed to pay attention to evidence. Now, the rest of my comments have to do with your evidence. If you want to tell me that there are people that accept evolutionism as a matter of faith, I believe you. If you want to tell me that that means that evolutionism and creationism are the same thing, I don't believe you. I would suggest.
No, I don't expect you to.
I would suggest that what you've done is present a good deal of evidence to the effect that bad evolutionism is being done, but really is not particularly good evidence for the point that I presumed you were trying to make. Let me go through my list. First of all, what Meyer says about how one ought to group things, men and apes, or birds and reptiles, or what have you. You give this as an example of the evolutionary taxonomist paradigm. I suggest it's not a particularly good example because phoneticists advance almost identical arguments about how things ought to be grouped, and they swear that there is no evolutionary basis to their procedure for grouping. Now, of course, it's possible that the phoneticists are wrong. It's also possible that Meyer is wrong. It's possible that what you're advancing as an example of an evolutionary procedure is in fact no such example, in which case it's not evidence for your position, it's evidence for something else. Let me expand on that. You've got this diagram here that you say Prager and Wilson disclosed in an otherwise unknown manuscript. Well, it's got little decimal points. At least I saw you making a futile effort to make decimal points with a chalk. And it's prepared from data that are DNA sequences, and that means that those decimal points can only have come from one place. They're branch links fitted by a branch link fitting procedure, not a parsimony procedure. You say that Prager and Wilson say the opposite. My reply to that is I've often called Prager and Wilson making computational mistakes in print before. In other words, they're incompetent.
I don't think much point in this argument about that.
Well, but no, wait, no. This is perfectly serious. You trot out this tree. You say Prager and Wilson used it. You say this was done by a program that was based on evolutionary principles. Now, if this tree is what I suspect it of being, not only is it not based on evolutionary principles, but it's based on a procedure that I recently criticized in my paper in the First Henning Society volume as relying on a set of suppositions that are that imply physical impossibilities. It's not only non-evolutionary, it's simply illogical in any sense whatsoever. Again, it's not evidence for what you're arguing for, it's evidence about something else. It's not evidence that evolutionists are doing something wrong, it's evidence that there are turkeys in the world. If they're calling themselves evolutionists, that's just another example of their turkeyism.
Do you disagree with this proposition? That's the
As a matter of fact, I do. That was going to be one of my last points. Not my very last, however. You've got molecular data with something done to it gives that.
Yeah.
Now, I suspect that of having been massaged in a bad way. I like your word massaged. With something which I gather from your analysis rather more reasonable done to it, it gives that. You suggest these are incongruent. No, they're not. If those are both regarded as undirected trees, which in fact they would have to be, since what you've got is data without a priori.
I didn't say they were incongruent. No.
Oh, okay. Well,
one has a hell of a lot more information than the other, and I asked where the extra information comes from. So yes, it comes from the program. That's all.
yes, and that's a bad program.
The
Well,
question
all right.
was, what does it tell us about? That's all.
It's a program that was made up. Let me go through. Let's see. You trotted through several examples of doing alpha hemoglobins, then myoglobins, then something else. In each case, attributing predictions to Meyer. I believe Meyer made the predictions. You were basing your clustering schemes or their failures to match predictions in each case on raw similarities. It's simply not a phylogenetic method. It's a phonetic method.
I wasn't doing a phylogenetic method. That
Well,
was
that's
demand of
precisely
evolution.
it. What you, in other words, you left out the possibility that Meyer was simply advocating the wrong sort of procedure for what he said he was doing, namely evolutionary taxonomy. Finally, let me give one final quip. You objected to the idea of the explanatory power of a hierarchy on two grounds. First, that it simply supposed that workers before Darwin were poor thinkers, and second, that the hierarchy was really imposed by ontogeny. Well, to take those in order, Newton at a certain point thought of the theory of gravitation. He did not at that time have observations available to him that hadn't been available to a lot of people before. Does this automatically mean that everybody before Newton was a poor thinker? Aristotle, I recall in particular, thought that celestial objects stayed up because that was in their inherent nature, and earthly objects fell down even when propped up because that was their inherent nature. Was Aristotle a poor thinker?
Okay, I withdraw that.
Finally, the hierarchy of ontogeny. Okay, I believe you, there's a hierarchy of ontogeny. As a matter of fact, if you want to say that molecular data are crummy, I believe that. In fact, I've often said the same thing. I'm not quite the same. But hierarchy of ontogeny. All right, let me ask you. I agree there's a hierarchy of ontogeny in the world as we see it, but is it a logical necessity that ontogeny be hierarchically structured? And if it's not, isn't there a theoretical question left, namely, why are apparent, that is, observed ontogenies hierarchically structured? In which case,
well, when they could be structured in some other way.
Yes.
Okay, I could make a whole lot of quips myself, but I won't. I would just say that where you made this contrast between what an evolutionist and what a creationist, how they would treat the same data, I can't see that these are that the one on the left is what a creationist would do. It's simply another evolutionary method of handling the data. That would be my observation. It seems to me a real creationist would say that since all of these things had obviously been separately created, that any resemblances would be totally random. The other question I would ask is something that I thought Steve Ferris was going to say, but he didn't quite get to it. Namely, how do you have a hierarchy of, unless this reflects in some way a hierarchy of phylogeny? To my mind, if you don't have a phylogeny, I can't see why you're going to get a hierarchy of ontogeny.
Now, did you mean to say something on that?
That was a vicious comment.
You want to make a answer the question?
Good heavens. Excuse me.
I don't know how to answer it. If it were possible for someone in here to convince me of the truth of evolution by statements like that, I should be delighted. That's about all I have to say. But the statement itself does not convince me of the truth of anything. I think Niles had his hand up first.
Yeah, the segment of that letter in Science that you read from, I think the next sentence was, but that's not the point.
What is the point now?
Well, that segment that you quoted, which was, I'm not accusing you of quoting out of context, I wrote that. So I think that hierarchy proves evolution. I wasn't trying to say it. But that's not the point. In principle, it is falsifying if we don't find that predictive hierarchy. Now, you got very close to saying that hierarchy doesn't exist. But then you said, well, it does exist.
The hierarchy, I agree with everybody, it exists at the morphological level, and I think we recognize large parts of it and agree on it.
Well,
the problem is the things that are descended, that are passed on from generation to generation, are not morphologies. They're genes, they're genomes. And I'm questioning whether the hierarchy is there in the genome. And if it isn't, then I think we have a real problem.
yeah, well, my question was, do you think by challenging the hierarchy, now you said it's a phenotypic hierarchy, so I don't know what you do. I thought you were getting very close to saying since we don't find a predictive pattern, then perhaps we have falsified the notion of evolution. But then you seem to conclude by saying that we don't need the notion of evolution to be systematic, which I think most of us even already agree with. So I'm not quite sure Well, John was well. So I would like you to rephrase just in 2 or 3 sentences, if you could, what your final conclusion is. Basically, who done it?
Who done what? Who done wrong?
Is there a hierarchy? Well, you just answered that already. And if so, who done it?
Who put the hierarchy in there? Ontogeny put it in there. If the hierarchy is there in the phenotype, but not in the genotype, then ontogeny put it in there.
I don't understand that.
Yeah, why not?
How can ontogeny put it there if it wasn't there in biology?
There are a lot of people want to ask questions. I'm going to let Dr. Patterson pick the people who will ask the questions. Everyone else will shut up until they're picked.
I don't want to be asked questions on this stuff. I'd rather you discuss it.
I think there's a lot here that we're going to have to get. It's very wonderful for me, wonderful representation. I agree with you 100%. Evolution is on a level with creationism. They're both very similar in being faith. Now, we cannot put our faith in evolution. We must put our faith in science and facts. Now, the old masters, Bayer, Cuvier, Braun, Gazet, Westphal, were pretty close to the truth. Bayer realized that the hierarchy was embryological, and the hierarchical consideration exists to the degree that metamorphic change occurs in embryos. And all changes in embryos are metamorphic.
Yes.
There is not one step in embryology that is not metamorphic. And this is where evolution goes out, and where we must concentrate our thoughts as scientists to bring new ideas in to science. Now, however, we must not go too fast and spend our time examining the particular trees and the leaves on the tree. It's best to look at the forest, the whole issue. And what I mean is this: science as a whole. The creationists were very wise. They brought in geologists, they brought in every field of astronomers, every field, and they had them work together on the ideas, all to show the weaknesses of evolution. If we as scientists refuse to see the weaknesses of evolution, then we will see science suffer from the onslaughts of creationists, because evolutionists cannot answer them. We must realize that the theory of evolution, Darwinism, led to new theories in geology, new theories in astronomy, to new chronologies. We take the history of science and see how the chronology of the age of the Earth has suddenly expanded over the last 100 years, from thousands to billions and billions. Yet everybody will tell you, who's in the know, that all our scales of measurement, all our radioisotope measurements, have no validity without the assumption of uniformity. That gradualism does not exist. That these things cannot exist if we do not stick to the premise of uniformity and evolution. Now, if evolution goes out, uniformity goes out, catastrophism comes in. We must accept the catastrophism that goes with creationism, and discard the creationists and come to a catastrophist ideas of science, such as Cuvier had, Agassiz, and all the guys who contributed so much to the advancement of science. I think it was Gertrude Himmelfarb in the book Darwin and Darwinism who points out how much the catastrophists did contribute and how little was contributed by the evolutionists. I think it should be the task of all of us to get together and work on these things, to reevaluate the facts of science.
Thank you. I think you was first, guys.
What I asked both you and I said, last remark that yes, we really don't need evolution to do systematics, and you have implied the trouble with doing systematics. Everything is constantly debated. How do you two account for statistics as a distinct school of phylogenetics or systematics? Don't you have to make constant assumptions of evolution when you take shared neuron character? Isn't the assumption there that because the ancestry was most recent ancestry, and therefore you have shared neuron? To me, that implies evolution.
It's not necessary to make the assumptions. The notion that you have to order things into primitive and derived is completely unnecessary as far as I
Because how
can
do you distinguish, Colin, between what's primitive and what's derived if you don't have an evolutionary assumption on it?
by the distribution of the characters.
Oh, so
Primitive characters in the old sense have a wider distribution than,
it's strictly a rule, and evolution has nothing to do with it.
well, as I understand it, yes. Kyle?
One of the tests of any kind research is slowly a mistake. You agree with that?
Yeah?
And then I put it to you that some years ago it was predicted that sometime there exists an animal with a double jaw articulation in between mammals and reptiles. This was predicted on the basis of our ontogeny, embryology, somewhere back in the 1890s, I believe. Along about 1950, a fossil was turned up named Dioxinatus that has double jaw articulation. And quite a bit later on, we have Phytolodontoideus, we have Toscalinatus, and probably a lot of other things for which we don't have the right pieces, which in fact have double jaw articulation. Would you let us not consider this prediction a piece of evidence in favor of evolution?
No, I would consider it another example of the threefold parallelism, which is a much more general theory than evolution as far as I can see. You know what it is, the threefold parallelism?
Please elucidate that.
It's a theory that I think is best linked with Agassiz. Agassiz thought he had empirical evidence that the transformations of ontogeny showed parallelisms with the transformation through the fossil record. He didn't think of this as a physical transformation at all, but he saw an unfolding in the fossil record, and that those two were parallel with a third set of data, which was the structure of the systematic hierarchy. And that yours would be an example of the parallelism between the fossil record and ontogeny.
What causes the parallelism?
Well, you tell me, Carl, what causes the parallelism?
Evolution does, that's what.
Can you tell me one thing about evolution? All right, it causes the parallelism between
Hey, listen, that's
ontogeny and the
100%
fossil
better
record.
than at the beginning of your seminar, Colin.
What?
That's 100% better than at the beginning of your seminar. At the beginning, you only had one thing, now you got two.
All right, Steve. Let me just finish this bit on prediction. All right. Giles?
Yes.
I'm reading from Gillespie again. From this book on Darwin and creationism. In its pure form, creationism predicted, does make predictions, or did make predictions, that no purely physical explanation of speciation would be found, that no transitional fossils would be discovered. Well, standing next to you is the man who said, as I understand it, that so far no transitional fossils and no purely physical explanation of speciation has been discovered. One can quote predictions in many
The
directions.
creationists say that I say.
I would like to offer two comments on a previous comment, the gentleman that mentioned Cuvier and Agassiz. There are two parts of that I regard as interesting. One is the idea that Cuvier pretty well had it worked out. I'll come back to that in a minute. And the other is that, as soon as we throw away the idea of uniformitarianism, then we have to bring in catastrophism. Well, that's a short, easy one. It's true that a principle of uniformitarianism in some form is required in order to interpret radiocarbon dating. It's not true that discarding that principle brings in catastrophism or indeed anything else in particular, logically speaking. Logically speaking, being purely technical about it, if you throw away that interpretation rule, uniformity, you're left with nothing. Of course, it's a little inaccurate to say that you're left with precisely nothing. That's true only of how you interpret radiocarbon dates. What was not mentioned is that if you throw away uniformity principles, you come up with paradoxes in lots of physical laws that, as far as I know, nobody objects to. For instance, if you throw away uniformity of radiocarbon dating, then in effect you're postulating drastic inconstancy of the gravitational constant, that idea that physicists have considered, but let us say there has been no strong evidence that that's in favor of it. Those two ideas are linked through relativity theory, because gravitation has an effect on time. So if you want to seriously maintain that you can't use radiocarbon dating, then you're questioning Einsteinian relativity. Now, I would suggest, in all seriousness, that that's a mouthful. And I would suggest, furthermore, that people that want to question radiocarbon dating on that particular basis had better be prepared to get into considerably heavier arguments than anything I've seen in the literature so far. Let me get back to Cuvier. Wait till I tell you about Cuvier. Cuvier was one of the people. Cuvier was the person that you said had it all pretty much figured out. Cuvier is one of my favorite subjects. Cuvier advanced a classification of the animals into four major groups, and argued that they were so different that there were unbridgeable gaps. The translation from French is perhaps a little sloppy, but you get the idea. That separated these gaps so unbridgeable that no comparisons at all could be made between the members of these different groups. One does not even have to be an evolutionist to dismiss this idea as absurd, because characters uniting two of Cuvier's embranchments have subsequently turned up. I refer to the mollusks and the annelids plus the arthropods. In other words, Cuvier did not have it all figured out. Let me give one more example. Cuvier was once developed his idea of functional morphology, which held among other things that it would be possible to reconstruct an entire unknown organism, a fossil, since Cuvier was interested in that sort of thing, given just one or a few of its parts. A salubrious opportunity came his way. He was presented with the tooth of a newly discovered species, which turned out to be a species of iguanodon from a coal bed in Belgium. He reconstructed the animal, went to the trouble of having a rather large cement statue of his reconstruction made. It's still in the Jardin des Plantes in Paris. The reconstruction rather looks like a rhinoceros. As most of you are aware, iguanodon was in fact a bipedal dinosaur. I would strongly suggest that Cuvier was a turkey, in other words. In any event, it doesn't matter whether Cuvier was a turkey or not. Any argument based on the idea that Cuvier had it all figured out is nothing other than an appeal to authoritarianism. Even if one is going to advance such arguments anyway, one should be careful to pick one's authorities. They should be selected so as to have made as few known mistakes as possible.
I'd like to say something, I'm not sure I'd like to phrase it properly, but it seems to me that what the creationists and the evolutionists have in common is that they're looking for causes. And what you are specifically not doing, what you're specifically doing in your talk today, is defining a world in which it's not necessary to look for causes. And you finish up by saying that in your view of systematics, and this is a systematic discussion, and it's better not to look for causes. Now, what I'm curious about is in this process of going through the rejection of a particular notion of a cause, there are two parts of it. One is that it, by itself, seems to lack evidence. And the other one is that it is independently, whether it was backed up by evidence or not, could still be said to be irrelevant to your view of systematics. Am I correct about that so far? Even if there was an evolution theory, it probably wouldn't change, that you liked, it probably wouldn't change your view of systematic.
It shouldn't, no.
Yeah.
Either that stuff is real, or if it's not real, then it's not worth doing.
Yeah. Now, the question I want to work around to then is, if your view of systematics is to produce patterns without a process, you bring in the notion of ontogeny, which you would define as pattern, I'm asking, rather than process, or some combination of the two?
No, it is a process, undoubtedly, isn't it? At the Hennig meeting last month, Norman Platnick said something that I thought was very interesting. I think it was Norman who said it. He said possibly pattern and process are homologous. Now, I don't know what that means. But then he went on to say that perhaps a pattern at one level is a process at a different level. I've tried to think about that afterwards and trying to make some sense out of it. It just remains interesting but impenetrable to me. Presumably Norman didn't say it without reason. He had some something in mind.
Well, Colin, you can think of the tissue interaction.
It wasn't Norman, it was me.
process, but you can think of it as pattern, development.
Well, the interaction can be thought of as a pattern as well.
Well, yes, I think so. It's part of the pattern of development, but in itself, it's a process.
Can I go on a second? And that is to say that if you do accept that the pattern changes over time, that is, you can define a pattern for the systematic of all the organisms that live in the development, and you have a different set of organisms for all the organisms that live in the mesozoic, anytime you like. That's a right.
No, I don't think the pattern does change over time.
Well, that's what I want to find out.
I think, I don't remember where Darwin says it, but Darwin was well aware of it, that long before him, people had found that the fossils of any period fitted into the recent system. The hierarchy is one, and all these different levels in it are not different patterns, they're part of the same hierarchy. There aren't any fossils that don't belong in a recent group of some sort. In some cases, the recent group is metazoa, but...
Sure, okay, then, but there is a hierarchy to the overall pattern, which has a time component.
I'm not aware of such a thing, I must say. That it seems to me that there is one hierarchy, and there are bits in it that are of different ages coming towards the recent, but I think I don't quite understand what you're saying. I don't think I quite understand what I'm saying. Better cut.
I'm trying to work around to saying that you can say what is evolution, particularly you keep the little part to lots of different things. But one of the things it is in people's minds is change over time, some kind of change over time.
Yes.
Okay, what is changing?
Well, if you're appealing to the fossil record, it's what is changing?
Yeah.
Well, if I knew what was changing, I would know something about evolution.
Okay, now all right. Is something changing? Has something changed?
Yes, it has. Things have become extinct. Mm.
No.
Have things...
No? Who said no?
Well,
I said, in your sequence of changes from a pre-teleos to a teleos,
Yes.
this sequence of changes must involve some kind of...
so let me follow the extinct. If you pick on extinction, you're saying that that as a pattern, things that have gone extinct at different times during the record. Okay. Would you back up and say that you would accept the other side of that coin, which is things that have arisen at different times in the fossil record?
Oh, yes, I would.
Okay. So there is a process of change over time. Yes. And it has a cause.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I just want to check.
I don't.
Everything you said is about systematics, and you can do systematics perfectly without knowing anything we care about evolution. But there is another process which says that, where the evidence seems to be that there is some process of change over time, and that it does have a cause.
Documented? Is this documented?
No, I'm just talking about what Colin thinks. And so I think that you and I would agree then that in our funny different ways, and we both have an idea that there's some kind of evolution, and that there's a cause for it, and it's worth investigating. Now I know that if you sort of try to put that in the box and look at it, we're not looking at the same thing, but is there not that commonality?
I think there is, yes, but it's, as you say, it's very, when you look in the box, it's very difficult to find anything there.
I know, yes.
And I can't distinguish how much of this is our common training and all the thousands of pages we've read.
I share that.
Just to follow Pete's point, just a little bit more searching for a pattern. Is it not also true that if you, are we accepting the fact that they...
This is Southie speaking.
Oh yes, yes. Oh, why not?
Then
If we can have relativity, for God's sake, we can have radioactivity.
then we can go back to older and older horizons, and I think it would be true to say that as we approach the present, there is an increase in the diversity of the biosphere, diversity, multiplicity of different organisms. That is to say, at first you find only prokaryotes. if they're occurring correctly. And then later on, you find some primitive eukaryotic algae, but you still have the prokaryotes. And then as you go on, you then add some vertebrates, and then you get vertebrates in higher plants. So that pattern, just added to Keith's remarks, would lead you, I think, to a kind of hierarchical, it could, logically, lead you to a kind of hierarchical descent with modification pattern.
Well, it couldn't logically lead you to that, no. It would certainly be consistent with that.
But, okay, that's all we need.
Yeah.
So that this pattern would seem to be there.
Well, the notion of increasing diversity, I mean, people have been trying to do sums about that for years, haven't they? I'm not at all sure that the results...
Well, I mean, we don't need fine details. If we just add the big groups and bring them in as time goes on, we will get a tree.
Yeah.
I mean, it could be represented by a tree. And I think that is what many people feel, given that there's a time limit.
Yeah.
That when this process of origination, which Keith is talking about, this then brings in a sense of conviction to this kind of descent.
Yes, we affirm the fact, but...
But I think you're wrong, Stanley. It doesn't get you to believe the next step in the evolutionary belief, which is the process of descent is by divergence from a common ancestor. There's no logic.
No, there's certainly no, because Charles Lyell's theory is just Charles Lyell's theory of
yeah, but
steady state.
Why didn't you find these others that only appeared later? Why didn't you find them earlier? In other words, you start making ad hoc things, don't you? More, in other words, you start bringing in much more functions for which certain than need.
Well, I think they're more ad hoc it's sort of like constant.
I think the question about why don't you find things earlier, that's one of the so-called predictions that sometimes offered as when people ask what the evolutionary theory predicts. Several people have said, well, it predicts you won't find human fossils in the Cambrian. And at first that sounds sensible, but thinking about it more, it seems to me that that's not a prediction that's exclusive to evolutionary theory. It's a prediction that's part of the comparative method, which is much more general than evolutionary theory. And that reference to the threefold parallelism was not entirely light-hearted. It is a much more general notion of a comparative method, which one can rely on. One isn't going to find exceptions to it. Now, of course, that the comparative method is consistent with evolution. I think none of us know of anything that's really inconsistent with it. But it's not the only thing that's consistent with it.
But then it doesn't actually give an explanation.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. But as Keith said, the imaginative leap from finding this system down there to the assumption that, yes, it's due to descent with modification is one that's not logically entailed at all.
Okay, I won't go that far.
I think it should be mentioned that the tree of life. The tree of life itself, like great chain of being, fundamentally, I think the rest of the book on that one works, can be traced to Lovejoy did, to the theological origins. And a lot of philosophy behind Darwin was theological, so Bacon and the Corpus. But the point is this, that there's a good body of thought and science pointing to polyphylity and even to each species being its own from the very origin of life. Now, I think you bring to mind Clark Austin's zoogenesis, Bird's nomogenesis, Daniel Rosa's oligogenesis, and in other words, where they make very good cases for development, each individual species being its own in the very beginning.
Why don't you have some of these individual species appearing back in the Paleozoic?
Why don't you have the Paleozoic? Now, a recent book we published, titled Deposits by by a group of 50 geologists, published by Spring in 1975, which points out that there were different tidal forces operating each geological layer. And if you measure these, and you realize that each geological layer is predominantly volcanic, then you may get the idea that each fluid erosions, microscopic methodology.
I'm sorry, you're very much mistaken.
You will
Look,
see that what he points to each layer.
let's reserve this for an after talk session. Is there any questions you would like to address to the speaker? James. Last question. That's the last question. Go ahead.
What about turning the thing around?
Yes.
Systemics make up the cladogram.
Yes.
They don't have to use evolution for it.
Yeah.
You present the cladogram to somebody who wishes to interpret his evidence in an evolutionary context.
Yes.
He assumes the cladogram is correct. He then puts his data on the cladogram, and he can make some kind of sense out of it. Let's not, maybe they're just scenarios, but anyhow, he makes some kind of sense out of it. Is there anything so heinous about or whatever it is?
No, not at
bad about
all.
that
Not at
process?
all. But that's not the way it's done. It seems to be done the other way around.
In other words, I'm just trying to salvage something.
People still seem to insist that the tree is the correct level of analysis. And they seem to do
Well,
so,
at this level, what I'm talking about cladogram here, it shades back and forth. Under strict definitions, it shades back and forth from tree to cladogram and back again. It's I'm not always sure if when I would attempt such a thing, even in my mind's mind, whether I'm working with a cladogram or a tree.
The interesting thing about that notion of it shifting in the mind is that, to me anyway, if you're working on a tree, then it seems, according to Michael Gislin and David Hull and various other people, that the elements of the tree are logical individuals. But if you shift in your mind and you turn it into a cladogram, they become universals. And when you shift it back again, they become individuals again.
But this has to do with the fact that a cladogram is an operational device that is useful for clarifying ideas or making it easy to work with ideas or entities of one sort or another, whether they are individuals or not. And I admit that this is maybe very sloppy thinking, but I don't see such great harm in it. I think it's...
Well, I hope you're right, Jim.
For comparative minds.
I hope you're right.
They're not systematists.
Yeah.
I think let's just thank